When I booked the remote cabin, I had no idea how isolated it really was. It wasn't like the cozy, Instagram-worthy retreats you see online. This was deep in the woods, far from anything resembling civilization. I had rented it for a week in the middle of winter to focus on my writing. I thought the quiet would help me concentrate. It was a rustic place. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, and heating came from a wood-burning stove. The online listing emphasized its solitude as a selling point. At the time, I thought that was perfect. I'd had enough of the noise and distractions of daily life. The idea of being completely alone, surrounded by snowy wilderness, sounded ideal. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive itself was unnerving. After turning off the main road, I followed a winding dirt path that seemed to go on forever. Snow had begun to fall, and the tire tracks from whoever had been there before me were already fading under the fresh layer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving the world behind entirely. The cabin appeared suddenly as I rounded a bend. It was smaller than I expected, a one-story structure with a pitched roof, nestled among tall pine trees. The snow was already ankle-deep as I stepped out of the car. The silence was immediate and overwhelming. No birds, no wind, just the soft crunch of snow underfoot and the faint hum of my car's engine. I grabbed my bag and trudged to the front door, the cold biting at my cheeks. Inside, the cabin was exactly as advertised. A single room with a bed, a small kitchen, a table and chair, and the wood stove. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and the single window on the far wall looked out onto an expanse of forest. There was no TV, no radio, just a stack of old books on a rickety shelf. I set about making the place livable. I unpacked my bag, started a fire in the stove, and put a pot of water on to boil for tea. As the warmth spread through the cabin, I started to relax. This was what I'd come for, peace and quiet. I sat at the table, pulled out my laptop, and began outlining ideas for my next project. The first night passed uneventfully. The fire crackled as I worked, and I eventually fell asleep to the sound of the wind picking up outside. When I woke the next morning, the world was blanketed in snow. It must have fallen all night, piling up against the door and the windowsill. I had a brief moment of doubt. What if the snow blocked the road? But I pushed the thought aside. I wasn't planning to leave until the week was up. I had enough food and firewood to last. By the third day, the isolation started to wear on me. The snow hadn't let up, and the forest seemed to close in tighter with each passing hour. I spent most of my time writing, but the words came slower and slower. The silence, once soothing, began to feel oppressive. I found myself listening for sounds, anything to break the monotony, but there was nothing. Just the creak of the cabin as it settled in the cold and the occasional rustle of branches outside. That night, I heard something new. It was faint at first, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. I froze, listening intently. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. My heart raced as I realized someone, or something, was moving outside. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was deliberate, purposeful. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up at the slightest noise. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to shake off the unease. I bundled up and went outside, thinking some fresh air would do me good. The snow was deep, but I could see tracks leading around the side of the cabin. They were too large to be from any animal I could think of, but I didn't want to dwell on it. I walked to the edge of the clearing, hoping to clear my head. The woods were eerily quiet. The snow muffled every sound, and the dense trees blocked out most of the light. I didn't go far. The thought of getting lost out there was too terrifying to entertain. When I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed something odd. The tracks I'd made on my way out were now joined by another set, running parallel to mine. I hadn't heard or seen anyone, but the prints were fresh, barely dusted with snow. I hurried back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone staring back at me. But the forest remained still, the snow falling steadily. That night, the noises started again. This time, they were louder, footsteps circling the cabin, the crunch of snow just outside the door. At one point, I thought I heard the handle jiggle. I sat frozen in bed, clutching a flashlight, too scared to move. The noises eventually stopped, but I didn't sleep a wink. By the 5th day, I was ready to leave. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I packed my things and stepped outside, my breath visible in the frigid air. The tracks were everywhere, crisscrossing the clearing and disappearing into the trees. They weren't just footprints anymore. There were drag marks, like something heavy had been pulled through the snow. I made my way to the car, my heart pounding in my chest. The windows were frosted over, but as I got closer, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Scrawled across the windshield in what looked like charcoal were the words, "Don't come back." I didn't waste any time. I threw my bag in the back seat and climbed in, fumbling with the keys. The engine sputtered to life, and I backed out of the clearing as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, but for a split second, I thought I saw movement. A shadow slipping between the pines. It took hours to reach the main road, and even longer to shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I finally made it home, I locked every door and window and collapsed onto the couch, still shaking. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods, but I haven't been back since. The cabin is still listed online. Every now and then, I see the ad pop up, promising unparalleled solitude and a true escape from the modern world. But I know the truth. There's something out there, something that doesn't want to be disturbed, and I have no intention of ever going back to find out what it is. When I first stumbled upon the ad for a secluded cabin in the woods, it felt like a dream come true. The listing promised solitude, breathtaking views of the mountains, and all the peace and quiet I'd been craving. Living in the city had worn me down. The constant hum of traffic, the crowded subway rides, the endless pressure to keep up with a fast-paced world. I needed to breathe, to reset, to reconnect with myself. A cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont seemed like the perfect retreat. The drive there was uneventful but beautiful. Rolling hills gave way to thick forests, the kind where the sunlight barely filters through. The road narrowed as I got closer, and soon I was bumping along a dirt track, surrounded by trees that seemed to grow taller the further I went. There were no other cars, no signs of people. Just me, my car, and the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind. The cabin was exactly as the pictures had shown. Small, rustic, and nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense woods. It had a pitched roof, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch with a couple of rocking chairs that creaked gently in the breeze. I could hear the faint trickle of a stream nearby. Inside, the cabin was cozy, with a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a single bedroom. The owners had left a note welcoming me and a stack of firewood neatly piled by the stove. It was perfect. The first day passed peacefully. I unpacked my things, explored the area around the cabin, and sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The air was crisp and cool, the kind that makes you feel alive. I didn't have cell service, but that was part of the appeal. No emails, no notifications, just me and nature. That night, I fell asleep to the soothing crackle of the fire. It was the deepest sleep I'd had in months, and when I woke up, I felt refreshed. I spent the morning hiking a trail I'd found nearby, following it to a ridge that offered a stunning view of the valley below. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set again. I made dinner, simpleton soup heated on the stove, and sat outside to eat, listening to the forest come alive with the sounds of crickets and owls. It wasn't until later that I started to feel uneasy. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book I'd brought, when I thought I heard something outside. First, I brushed it off. It was probably just an animal, a raccoon or a deer. But the sound came again, louder this time. It was a sharp snap like a branch breaking underfoot. I froze, straining to listen. The woods were quiet again, but my pulse had quickened. I told myself it was nothing. I'd grown up in Vermont. I knew the woods could play tricks on your mind. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come as easily that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside had me on edge. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, until exhaustion finally won. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself. I spent the day exploring more trails, but I couldn't fully relax. Every so often, I'd get the feeling that I was being watched. I'd stop and look around, but there was never anyone there. It was just the trees, tall and silent, their shadows stretching across the forest floor. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd closed it before I left. My stomach tightened as I stepped inside. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure they were locked, then tried to convince myself that I'd simply forgotten to close the door properly in the morning. That night, the noises came again. This time, they were closer. It wasn't just one or two snaps. It was a series of sounds, like footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening intently. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. I held my breath, my ears straining for any sound. Then, a soft thud against the porch. I clutched the blanket tighter, fear coursing through me. The thud came again, and then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn finally broke, I mustered the courage to go outside and look. There were footprints on the porch, large, heavy ones that didn't belong to me. My stomach churned. Whoever had been out there hadn't tried to get inside, but they'd been close, too close. I decided to cut my trip short. The cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. I packed my things quickly, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. As I loaded my bags into the car, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I'd get back to the city, to people, to safety. The dirt road seemed longer on the way out. The trees pressed in on either side, and the forest felt darker, more oppressive. About halfway down the road, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing in the trees, partially hidden by the shadows. They didn't move, didn't wave. They just stood there, watching. My foot slammed down on the gas, and I didn't look back. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I sat there for a long time trying to calm down. I never saw the figure again, but the memory of that weekend still haunts me. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back. I've always enjoyed solo trips into nature. There's something about the solitude and the rawness of the outdoors that helps me disconnect from the constant buzz of daily life. So, when I had the chance to take a week off work, I decided to rent a cabin in a remote area up north. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just a vague mention to a few friends and family that I'd be off the grid for a bit. It felt good, liberating even, to know I'd have no distractions, no responsibilities, and no pressure. The cabin I found was in a region I wasn't familiar with. I picked it mostly because of how secluded it was. The listing described it as a rustic retreat, perfect for those seeking solitude. It was a small, one-room wooden cabin with a fireplace, a basic kitchen, and no running water. I liked the idea of roughing it a bit. The pictures showed it nestled in a dense forest, with a little stream nearby and a wooden deck overlooking the trees. The drive up was uneventful at first. I left early in the morning, and the highways gave way to smaller roads, which eventually became gravel paths winding through thick forests. The GPS was spotty, but I had printed out the directions beforehand. I remember feeling a thrill of excitement as I turned onto the final stretch, a narrow dirt road flanked by towering pines. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures, maybe a little more weathered, but still charming in its own way. The air was cool and crisp, carrying that earthy smell of the forest. I unloaded my supplies, enough food and water for a week, plus some firewood and a small camping stove, and set about settling in. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I expected. A bit dusty but cozy. There was a single bed against one wall, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, and shelves stocked with mismatched crockery and a few cans of food. The fireplace looked like it had seen better days, but it seemed functional. A stack of old newspapers and magazines sat in a corner, and there were a few oil lamps for light. The first evening was peaceful. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat on the deck, listening to the sounds of the forest. As the sun set, the woods became alive with the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt content, even a bit proud of myself for taking this trip. But things started to feel off the next day. It wasn't anything dramatic, just small things that made me uneasy. When I went to fetch water from the stream, I thought I heard faint footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was no one there, just the stillness of the forest. Later, while chopping some kindling, I got the distinct feeling I was being watched. Again, I looked around and saw nothing. I chalked it up to my imagination and the unfamiliar surroundings. That night, I woke up to a noise outside the cabin. It sounded like someone, or something, walking around. The steps were slow and deliberate, crunching the fallen leaves and twigs just outside the walls. I lay in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear more. But after a few minutes, the sound stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, though it was hard to shake the feeling that it had been something else. The following day, I decided to explore the area a bit, hoping that keeping busy would calm my nerves. The forest was dense, and the paths were overgrown, but it was beautiful. I hiked for a couple of hours, following the stream upstream. At one point, I came across what looked like an old campsite, an overgrown clearing with the remnants of a fire pit and a few rusted cans scattered around. It didn't look like anyone had used it in years, but it gave me an eerie feeling, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to find. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. I was tired but glad to be back. As I approached the cabin, though, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The door, which I was sure I had latched, was slightly ajar. I stood frozen for a moment, every instinct telling me not to go inside. But I had no choice, it was my only shelter. I pushed the door open cautiously, my heart racing. The cabin looked just as I had left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked my belongings, and everything seemed to be in place. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That night was the worst. I had trouble falling asleep, my mind replaying the events of the day. When I finally drifted off, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. It sounded like it came from the deck. I grabbed the flashlight I had kept by the bed and pointed it at the window, but all I could see was darkness. The banging came again, followed by a scraping sound, like something being dragged. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my things. The romantic idea of a week of solitude had vanished. I just wanted to get out of there, but when I went to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. The engine sputtered weakly before dying completely. Panic set in as I tried again and again, but the car was dead. I had no choice but to hike back down the dirt road to the nearest town, which was miles away. I grabbed my backpack, loaded it with essentials, and started walking. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less inviting, more oppressive. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. As I walked, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints on the road, fresh ones, heading in the same direction as me. They were larger than mine, and the gait was uneven, as if whoever made them had a limp. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding with every step. The footprints continued for miles before veering off into the woods. I didn't stop to investigate. By the time I reached the main road, I was exhausted, but relief washed over me when I saw a car approaching. The driver was an older man who looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. I must have looked half-crazed, but he didn't ask many questions. He gave me a ride into town, where I contacted a towing service for my car. When the tow truck driver went to retrieve the car, he called me with a strange tone in his voice. He asked if I had left anything on the deck of the cabin. I hadn't. He told me there were deep scratches on the wooden planks, like something had clawed at it. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out what or who was out there. All I know is that the solitude I once craved now feels more like a curse than a blessing. I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods. I needed to get away from everything: work, people, noise. I rented this cabin after reading about it in an online forum for hiking enthusiasts. It was advertised as remote, rustic, and perfect for solitude. That sounded ideal for me. The thought of no cell service, no internet, and just the sounds of nature seemed like the perfect way to reset my mind. The drive to the cabin was uneventful at first, just a couple of hours of highways and then some winding back roads. The last 30 minutes were on a dirt path that could barely be called a road. My small SUV handled it fine, but I couldn't stop thinking how anyone would manage to get help out here if something went wrong. The deeper I drove into the forest, the denser the trees became, until they formed a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. I rolled down the windows and breathed in the cool, pine-scented air. When I finally arrived, the cabin was smaller than I had expected. It was a simple wooden structure with a slanted roof and a small porch out front. There was an old rocking chair on the porch and a pile of chopped wood stacked neatly by the side. The cabin looked like it had been standing for decades. The wood was weathered and gray, and the windows were a little foggy from years of grime. It wasn't the cozy retreat I had imagined, but it had its charm. The first thing I noticed as I stepped out of the car was how quiet it was. Not just peaceful quiet, but heavy, pressing silence. There wasn't a single bird chirping or the sound of a squirrel scurrying through the underbrush. The only noise was the crunch of gravel under my boots and the occasional creak of the rocking chair as the wind pushed it gently. I unpacked my things quickly. I had brought the basics: canned food, a camping stove, a sleeping bag, and a couple of books. The cabin didn't have electricity or running water, but it did have an old wood stove and a few lanterns with extra oil. There was a small creek about 50 yards from the cabin where I could get water if needed. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the wood stove, ate some soup, and read until my eyes grew heavy. I fell asleep to the faint crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of trees outside. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore the area. There were no marked trails nearby, so I just wandered through the woods, keeping the cabin within sight at first. The forest was thick, but there were clearings here and there where sunlight broke through. I found the creek and followed it upstream for a while. The water was crystal clear and cold, and I cupped my hands to take a drink. After a couple of hours, I returned to the cabin. That's when I noticed something strange. The rocking chair on the porch was turned slightly, as if someone had sat in it and shifted its position. I was sure it had been facing straight out when I arrived. I brushed it off, thinking maybe the wind had moved it, but there wasn't enough wind for that. Still, I convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. The second night, I woke up to a noise outside. It was faint, but distinct. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on gravel. My heart started pounding as I lay there, frozen. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. It stopped after a few minutes, and I eventually fell back asleep, though it was restless. In the morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were unmistakably human, and they weren't mine. They were larger than my boots, and they led from the edge of the woods to the porch and then back into the trees. My stomach sank. I debated leaving right then and there, but I convinced myself to stay. It was probably just a hiker who had stumbled across the cabin, I thought. Maybe they were curious and came closer to take a look. I didn't want to overreact. I spent the rest of the day trying to keep myself busy. I chopped some wood, cleaned the cabin, and read. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would look up from my book, certain I had seen movement in the trees. But there was never anything there. That night, I locked the cabin door and propped a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I kept the lantern burning low and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps. This time, they were closer. They stopped right outside the cabin. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought whoever was outside would hear it. I held my breath, straining to listen. After a few moments of silence, there was a loud bang on the door, like someone had slammed their fist against it. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The banging continued, slow and deliberate. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the heavy flashlight I had brought with me as a weapon. When the sun finally rose, I cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. There was no one there, but the footprints were back. This time, they circled the cabin several times before disappearing into the woods. My hands were shaking as I packed my things. I didn't care if I had paid for a full week. I was leaving. As I loaded my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. But there was no one. The drive back felt like it took forever. The narrow dirt road seemed even more winding and claustrophobic than before. Every shadow in the trees looked like a person. I didn't relax until I was back on the highway, with other cars around me and the open sky above. When I got home, I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they didn't seem too concerned. They said it was probably just a prank or a drifter passing through. I wanted to believe them, but something about the whole experience felt wrong. Months later, I found myself thinking about the cabin again. I looked it up online to see if anyone else had stayed there and had a similar experience. That's when I found a post in the same hiking forum where I had discovered it. Someone else had rented the cabin a few weeks after me, and their story was almost identical. Footsteps, banging on the door, and footprints circling the cabin. They too had left early. No one ever found out who or what was out there. But one thing was clear: I would never set foot in that forest again. I've always enjoyed hiking alone. There's a sense of freedom in it, no schedule, no one to keep up with, just me and the trails. Last October, I decided to take a week off work and head into the mountains for some solitude. I booked a small cabin deep in the woods, far from any towns or roads. It was the kind of place you'd picture when you think of escaping from the noise of the world. A simple wooden structure, surrounded by towering pine trees, with a creek running nearby. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected. The paved roads turned to gravel, and the gravel roads eventually turned to dirt. My GPS stopped working about an hour in, so I had to rely on the printed directions provided by the rental company. By the time I arrived, the sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains. The cabin looked cozy enough, small, but sturdy. There was a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room with a wood-burning stove. No electricity, but there was a stack of firewood on the porch and a few oil lamps inside. The first night passed uneventfully. I lit a fire, read by lamplight, and fell asleep early, lulled by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I woke up refreshed, ready to explore the area. I spent the day hiking, wandering deeper into the forest, and enjoying the crisp autumn air. I didn't see another soul all day, which was exactly what I wanted. That night, though, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a vague sense that something wasn't right. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. I've always been a bit jumpy when I'm alone in the woods, but I'd never let it stop me before. I double-checked the door and window locks before going to bed, something I don't usually bother with in the middle of nowhere. The sound that woke me up came around 2 a.m. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, creaking noise, like wood bending under pressure. But as I lay there, holding my breath, I realized it was coming from the porch. It sounded deliberate, like someone or something was walking slowly across the wooden planks. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there might hear it. The cabin was pitch black, the fire long since burned out. I didn't have my phone. It was charging off a small solar panel I'd set up during the day. The only light was a faint sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The footsteps stopped. Then, a soft scraping sound began, like metal against wood. I realized with a sickening jolt that it was coming from the door. Someone was trying to pick the lock. I grabbed the hunting knife I'd brought with me, my hands trembling. I hadn't brought it for protection, just for cutting rope or opening food packages, but it was the only weapon I had. I crept out of bed as quietly as I could, pressing my ear to the door. The scraping continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. Then it stopped. I didn't dare open the door or peek out the window. I just stood there in the dark, clutching the knife, straining to hear any sound. Finally, I heard footsteps again, retreating down the porch steps and crunching through the leaves. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found scratch marks around the door lock. Whoever it was hadn't managed to get in, but they'd been close. I packed my things and decided to leave, but when I got to my car, my stomach sank. One of the tires was flat. Not just flat, slashed. Deep, deliberate cuts. I had a spare, but it wasn't much use without a working jack. Mine was missing, though I knew I'd packed it. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could have been animals, though deep down I knew that wasn't true. I decided to hike to the nearest ranger station, which was about 10 miles away according to the map. I figured I'd get help, come back with someone, and leave as soon as possible. The hike was grueling, not because of the terrain, but because I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me whipping my head around. I saw nothing, but the forest felt too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. About halfway to the station, I found something that made my blood run cold. A cigarette, but still faintly smoking, lying in the middle of the trail. I don't smoke, and I hadn't seen anyone else out here. Whoever had left it couldn't have been far ahead or behind. I sped up, practically jogging the rest of the way. When I finally reached the station, it was closed. There was a notice pinned to the door saying the ranger had gone into town and would be back the next morning. There was a bench outside, so I sat down, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to hike back to the cabin, not in the dark, but I wasn't sure staying here was any safer. As I sat there, I noticed something in the distance. A faint column of smoke rising above the trees, back in the direction I'd come from. My stomach turned. The cabin. It had to be. I debated going back, but I didn't have any supplies with me, not even a flashlight. I decided to wait until morning. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I kept hearing noises in the woods, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else. When dawn finally came, I headed back toward the cabin. The smoke was gone by the time I got there, but the sight that greeted me was worse than I'd imagined. The cabin was burned to the ground. Nothing was left but a smoldering pile of ash and charred wood. My car was still there, but it had been vandalized beyond repair. Windows shattered, tires slashed, engine gutted. I didn't have time to process it. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, coming from the trees. I turned, knife in hand, and saw a figure standing just inside the tree line. They were wearing a dark hoodie, the hood pulled up, face obscured. They didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me. I didn't wait to see what they would do. I took off running, not stopping until I reached a main road hours later. A passing car picked me up and drove me to the nearest town. I reported everything to the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. They said it was probably just a drifter or a prank gone too far. I never found out who it was or why they did what they did. The cabin's owner claimed not to know anything, though they seemed oddly evasive when I pressed them about previous renters. I haven't gone hiking alone since. The thought of being out there, isolated and vulnerable, still makes my skin crawl. Some nights, I wake up to the sound of footsteps outside my window. I tell myself it's just a dream, but I've started keeping the knife under my pillow, just in case. The decision to spend a weekend alone in a remote cabin had seemed like a great idea at first. I needed a break. My job was suffocating. My social life was non-existent, and the constant buzz of notifications from my phone had started to feel like a chain around my neck. When I found the listing for the cabin online, it felt like the perfect escape. The pictures showed a cozy, wooden structure tucked away in the woods, surrounded by towering pine trees and not another soul in sight. No internet, no cell service, just what I needed. I packed light, a backpack with clothes, some canned food, a sleeping bag, and a flashlight. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from my place, and the last stretch was on a dirt road that wound through the forest. The rental instructions were simple. There'd be a key under the mat, and I'd need to chop wood for the stove if I wanted heat. That was fine by me. I was looking forward to the simplicity of it all. When I arrived, the cabin looked just like the pictures. It was small but charming, with a stone chimney puffing out a lazy stream of smoke from the previous renter, and a wraparound porch that creaked under my boots. The air was cool and smelled like pine needles and damp earth. A rusted axe leaned against a stump near the cabin, with a small pile of chopped wood stacked neatly beside it. Inside, it was even more rustic than I expected. The furniture was old but sturdy, with mismatched cushions and a thick layer of dust on the shelves. There was a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with a wood stove and a rocking chair. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, then unpacked my things. The first day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon splitting logs and stacking them near the porch, then made myself a simple dinner of canned soup heated on the stove. As the sun set, the cabin grew darker than I'd imagined. Without electricity, I relied on a few candles and my flashlight, their flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. The silence was both soothing and unsettling. Back home, there was always some kind of noise, cars, neighbors, the hum of electronics. Here, the only sounds were the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the rustle of leaves outside. That night, I fell asleep quickly, worn out from the day's work. But I woke up around 2 a.m., startled by a sound I couldn't place. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there, I realized it was more rhythmic, like footsteps crunching through the leaves. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that it sounded too deliberate. I stayed in bed, straining to hear more, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and drifted off again. The next morning, I checked around the cabin for any signs of wildlife, but didn't find anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone out here. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less serene, more watchful. I spent the day exploring the woods, following a narrow trail that wound past a small creek and up a rocky hill. The forest was beautiful, but I couldn't fully relax. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. I was exhausted but uneasy. As I sat by the wood stove eating dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps I'd heard the night before. That night, I decided to keep my flashlight and a heavy stick within arm's reach. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. The footsteps had felt too human, too intentional. Sure enough, sometime after midnight, I heard them again. This time, they were closer, circling the cabin. I held my breath, gripping the stick tightly. The steps were slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves outside my window. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to stay silent. I didn't dare look out the window. I was too afraid of what I might see. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. I waited for hours, listening to the deafening silence, but they didn't return. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were unmistakably human, large, with the tread of heavy boots. My stomach turned as I realized someone had been watching me. I spent the day on edge, jumping at every sound. I didn't want to stay another night, but the dirt road back to the main highway was treacherous in the dark, and I wasn't sure my car could handle it. I decided to leave first thing in the morning. That evening, as I was chopping wood, I noticed something odd. The pile I'd stacked the day before was smaller. At first, I thought I'd miscounted, but then I saw the faint drag marks leading into the woods. Someone had taken some of the logs. Panic set in. Whoever was out there wasn't just watching me, they were toying with me. I locked the cabin door and barricaded it with a chair, then sat by the stove with the axe in my lap. The footsteps came again that night, louder and more aggressive. They circled the cabin, then stopped by the door. I held my breath as I heard the doorknob rattle. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. After a few tense minutes, the rattling stopped, and the footsteps retreated into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the axe and listening for any sign of movement. As soon as the sun rose, I grabbed my things and bolted to my car. The drive back felt endless, my hands trembling on the wheel. I never found out who or what was out there. When I reported it to the rental company, they brushed it off, saying it was probably a local messing around. But I knew it wasn't just a prank. I haven't been back to the woods since. Every so often, I'll dream about that cabin, the sound of footsteps in the dark, and the chilling feeling of being watched. It was supposed to be an escape, but it ended up being a nightmare I'll never forget. I always liked spending time outdoors. It gave me a sense of calm I couldn't find anywhere else. So when I had the chance to rent a cabin deep in the woods for a week, I didn't think twice. The idea of disconnecting from everything and just breathing in the quiet sounded perfect. The cabin wasn't fancy, and that's exactly why I chose it. It was about 10 miles from the nearest paved road and sat near a small lake. The rental listing promised solitude, a wood-burning stove, and access to some great hiking trails. It sounded like heaven. When I arrived, the sun was starting to set. The road leading to the cabin was little more than a dirt path, full of potholes and lined with thick trees. My car's tires crunched over twigs and loose gravel as I approached. The cabin came into view slowly, like it was revealing itself. It was small, just a single-story wooden structure with a tin roof. The windows were dark, and the porch had a couple of old chairs that looked like they hadn't been used in years. The place felt forgotten, like it was waiting for someone to wake it up. Inside, it was exactly what I expected. Simple but functional. There was a small kitchen with a gas stove, a tiny table with mismatched chairs, and a couch that sagged in the middle. The bedroom had a creaky bed with a thin mattress and blankets that smelled faintly of mothballs. There was no electricity, just an oil lamp on the table and a couple of candles scattered around. I felt a small thrill at the idea of living like this for a week. No distractions, no noise, just me and nature. The first day passed peacefully. I spent the morning hiking along a trail that wound through the woods and circled the lake. The air was cool, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. The only sounds were the rustling trees and the occasional bird call. It was exactly what I had hoped for. Back at the cabin, I made a simple dinner on the gas stove and ate it on the porch while watching the sun dip below the trees. The sky turned shades of pink and orange before fading to a deep blue. I felt completely at peace. That night, as I lay in bed, I noticed how dark it was. Without any nearby towns or streetlights, the darkness felt absolute. The only light came from the stars and a faint sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. I found it comforting at first. Then I heard the first sound. It was faint, almost like a whisper, and I thought it might be the wind. But as I listened, I realized it was coming from the woods. It was a low, rhythmic rustling, like someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. I told myself it was probably just an animal. After all, I was in the middle of the woods. Animals made noises. That was normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate. I lay there for a long time listening. The sound came and went, fading into the distance and then growing louder again. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window. The woods were quiet again, and I told myself I had probably imagined it. Sleep deprivation could do that, right? The second day was uneventful. I went for another hike, this time venturing farther along the trail. I found a clearing with wildflowers and sat there for a while, enjoying the view. I tried to let the peacefulness of the day erase the unease I'd felt the night before. That evening, as the sun set, I noticed how quickly the woods changed. The warm, inviting atmosphere of the day shifted to something cooler, more closed off. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin, which had felt so welcoming just hours earlier, now felt like a fragile bubble in an endless sea of darkness. I went to bed early, hoping that sleep would come quickly. But as soon as the house was silent, the noises started again. This time they were louder. It wasn't just the rustling sound anymore. I heard snapping branches and something that sounded like footsteps. They weren't fast or frantic. They were slow, measured, and deliberate. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. My heartbeat felt impossibly loud, like it was competing with the sounds outside. I told myself it was just deer or maybe a bear, but deep down I didn't believe that. It felt too intentional. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, a new sound would jolt me awake. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but the daylight brought a sense of safety, and I convinced myself I was overreacting. On the third day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't feel like venturing into the woods. Something about them felt wrong now, like they were watching me. I spent most of the day on the porch, reading a book I'd brought with me. The day passed slowly, and I couldn't shake the tension in my chest. That night, the noises started earlier. I heard the footsteps again, this time closer. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The sounds circled the cabin, moving from one side to the other. At one point, they stopped right outside the bedroom window. I held my breath, waiting. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Then I heard it. A low, heavy exhale, like someone or something was standing just inches away from me, separated only by the thin wall of the cabin. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed curled up in bed, clutching a flashlight I'd found in one of the drawers. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the curtains, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost cried. By the fourth day, I was ready to leave. The solitude I'd craved now felt suffocating, and the cabin that had seemed so inviting felt like a trap. But when I tried to start my car, the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery, the fuel gauge, everything I could think of, but nothing worked. I was stuck. I spent the rest of the day trying to come up with a plan. There was no cell service, and the nearest town was too far to walk before nightfall. I decided I'd wait until morning and then make the trek. The idea of spending another night in the cabin filled me with dread, but I didn't have a choice. That night, the noises were louder than ever. I heard something scrape against the walls of the cabin, followed by a series of thuds, like something was throwing rocks at the roof. I stayed in the bedroom, the door locked, though I knew it wouldn't stop anything or anyone that really wanted to get in. When morning finally came, I packed a small bag and started walking. The woods were eerily quiet, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. It took hours to reach the main road, but when I did, I almost collapsed from relief. A truck passed by not long after, and the driver was kind enough to give me a ride into town. I explained what had happened, and he nodded grimly, saying people often underestimated how strange and isolating the woods could be. I never went back for the car. I never even called the rental agency to explain. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't something I wanted to understand. The cabin could stay empty. It wasn't my place anymore. Even now, months later, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. And when I wake up, I always check my doors and windows just to be sure.